What if I told you Hitler had Iranian members in the SS? Not prisoners, not forced laborers, actual Nazi party members who moved to Germany, studied at universities and fought for the Third Reich. This seems impossible, right? The Nazis obsessed over racial purity, blonde hair, blue eyes, Nordic features. But here's the twist. Hitler personally declared Iran an Aryan country, and one Iranian Nazi even copied Hitler's mustache and mannerisms. That misunderstanding reveals something darker about how Nazi racial ideology actually worked. Most people think Aryan meant blonde, blue-eyed, Nordic. That's not what the Nazis believed. The term Aryan comes from ancient Indo-Iranian peoples. The word itself is Sanskrit and Persian, meaning noble. And the Nazis knew this. In Nazi racial theory, Aryan didn't mean German or Nordic exclusively. It meant Indo-European, a linguistic and cultural category that included Germans, yes, but also Iranians, Indians, and even some Turks. The public image of Nazi propaganda, the posters of blonde families, that was marketing. The actual racial classifications were far more complex and, frankly, arbitrary. But here's where it gets even more cynical. Some Nazi racial theorists actually believed that modern Iranians had lost their ancient Aryan purity through racial mixing over centuries. By their own pseudo-scientific logic, contemporary Iranians shouldn't have qualified as pure-blooded Aryans. The Nazi regime chose to ignore this. They declared Iranians racially kindred anyway. Why? Because they needed an ally in the Middle East. And nowhere is this clearer than in how the Nazis treated Iran in the 1930s. If you appreciate deep dives into history's most misunderstood facts like this, I'd be grateful if you'd consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more people discover these stories. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. In the 1930s, Iran and Nazi Germany developed close diplomatic and economic ties. Why? Iran wanted to modernize and distance itself from British and Soviet influence. Both powers had historically dominated Persian politics and oil resources. Germany wanted allies, markets, and access to resources. But there was also an ideological component that made this alliance unique. In 1935, Iran officially requested that other countries use Iran instead of Persia in formal communications. This wasn't just a name change. The word Iran literally derives from Aryana, meaning land of the Aryans. This wasn't coincidence. Iranian intellectuals and the Pahlavi dynasty emphasized their Aryan heritage to position themselves as equals to Europeans, distinct from their Arab neighbors. And Nazi Germany enthusiastically agreed. The official Nazi foreign ministry position was documented. There was no doubt that the Iranian, as an Aryan, was racially kindred, artverwandt, with the Germans. This wasn't informal opinion. This was official policy, and it came from the top. Hitler himself personally declared Iran to be an Aryan country. As a result, Iranians were classified as pure-blooded Aryans and exempt from the Nuremberg laws. The racial laws that prohibited Jews from marrying Germans, attending universities, or holding certain professions, these didn't apply to Iranians. But here's what recent scholarship reveals. The real foundation of this alliance was economics, not ideology. Reich Economics Minister Hjalmar Schacht's new plan used clearing agreements to stimulate trade during the Great Depression. This aligned perfectly with Reza Shah's ambitions for Iran's industrial modernization. By 1938, Germany had become Iran's #1 trading partner, overtaking Britain and the USSR. This rapid economic integration involved major infrastructure projects like the Trans-Iranian Railroad. The Aryan connection wasn't the cause of the alliance, it was the justification, a convenient ideological wrapper for a pragmatic economic and geopolitical partnership. And in 1939, Nazi Germany sent Iran a gift that sealed this spiritual affinity: 7,500 books, called the Deutsche Wissenschaftliche Bibliothek, the German Scientific Library. The preface was written by Alfred Rosenberg, the chief Nazi racial ideologue. He wrote about the spiritual affinity between Germany and Iran. This wasn't just trade, this was ideological theatre, and some Iranians took it very seriously. Meet Davud Monshizadeh, born in Iran on August 28, 1914. In 1937, at 23 years old, he moved to Germany to study at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, one of Germany's most prestigious institutions. He didn't just study. He joined the SS. He became a member of the Nazi Party. And here's where it gets disturbing. Monshizadeh deliberately copied Hitler's appearance. He grew the same toothbrush mustache. He wore similar clothing. He imitated Hitler's mannerisms and speaking style. He wanted to physically resemble his idol. During the war, Monshizadeh worked as a translator for Soviet POW interrogations. He wrote articles for Das Reich, the Nazi propaganda newspaper. He ran nightly anti-Semitic broadcasts in Persian on Deutsche Radio. Every night, Monshizadeh and other pro-Nazi Iranians broadcast anti-Jewish propaganda across the Middle East. Another Iranian broadcaster, Bahram Shahrukh, called for attacks on Jews during Purim in 1941. The Nazis even considered Monshizadeh an expert on the Jewish question. And the propaganda worked. In 1941 in Tehran, swastikas were painted on Jewish homes and shops. Anti-Semites prepared for Yehud Koshan, the massacre of the Jews. Jews were warned in the streets to leave Iran while they could. Holocaust terror was being exported to the Middle East in real time. Nazi Germany's Persian broadcasts also called Iranian politicians with anti-German views crypto-Jews, accusing them of secretly being Jewish. Classic Nazi conspiracy theories, now global. Even Iranian infrastructure reflected Nazi racial ideology. Iranian railways constructed by German engineers were specifically ordered to avoid employing any person of Jewish descent in any subdivision. By the war's end, Monshizadeh was fighting in the Battle of Berlin in April 1945, one of the final stands of the Third Reich. After Germany's defeat, did he abandon his ideology? No. In 1952, he founded Sumka, the Pan-Iranist Party, a fascist movement modeled directly on National Socialism. The party adopted fascist aesthetics but replaced the swastika with a stylized faravahar, an ancient Zoroastrian symbol. And here's the bizarre intellectual twist. Monshizadeh translated works of Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset from Spanish to Persian, hoping they'd serve as founding principles for the party. Spanish philosophy as the basis for Iranian Nazism. But here's the final irony. After fighting for the Nazis and founding an Iranian fascist party, Monshizadeh became a professor at Uppsala University in Sweden, one of Europe's most prestigious institutions. He taught Iranian linguistics there until his death on July 13, 1989. A Nazi SS member became a respected Swedish academic, and when he died, he was buried in Uppsala Old Cemetery, Sweden, not in his homeland Iran. The founder of Iranian National Socialism is buried in liberal Scandinavia. But the Nazi willingness to bend racial categories didn't stop with Iranians. In 1936, just before the Berlin Olympics, the Turkish ambassador to Germany requested that the German Foreign Ministry officially classified Turkish citizens as European for racial purposes. The Nazis granted the request. Think about that. The same regime implementing increasingly strict racial laws officially declared that non-Jewish Turks were a racially pure European Volk, and therefore kindred. Why? Strategic necessity. Turkey controlled the straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Germany desperately wanted to keep Turkey friendly. So, despite all the pseudoscientific racial theories, Turkey got an exemption. Non-Jewish Turks could live, work, and study in Germany without restrictions. But here's the dark detail that reveals just how cynical this was. The European status applied only to non-Jewish Turks. At the very same time the Nazis were granting this exemption, the Turkish government was systematically stripping thousands of its own Jewish citizens living abroad, particularly in France, of their nationality. These Turkish Jews lost their consular protection, they became stateless, and stateless Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe faced deportation and death. This wasn't just Nazi flexibility, this was international complicity. The Nazis bent their racial rules to accommodate a partner state that was, in turn, abandoning its own Jewish minority to the Holocaust. Turkey got favorable treatment for its non-Jewish citizens while throwing its Jewish citizens to the wolves. The Nazis bent their supposedly scientific racial theories whenever politics demanded it, and other governments were willing to play along. And then there's Japan. The Japanese are East Asian. By Nazi racial theory, they should have been classified far below Aryans. But Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Germany in 1936. They were allies, so the term honorary Aryans began circulating in diplomatic circles. But here's the twist. Recent scholarship from Cambridge University revealed that honorary Aryan was never official Nazi policy. It was a rumor, one that Japanese Germans and diplomats exploited to negotiate concessions and function as a protected minority. The Nazis allowed the ambiguity to spread because it served their interests. No formal classification meant no formal commitment, but enough protection to maintain the alliance. This posture of strategic delay let the regime have it both ways. They could claim ideological consistency while making case-by-case exceptions whenever politically useful. The term sounds official. It feels like policy, but it was diplomatic theater, and this reveals something critical about how Nazi racial ideology actually functioned. While Iranians were racial kindred and Turks were European and Japanese had ambiguous honorary Aryan status, the Nazis were planning the extermination of Slavs, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians. These are Indo-European peoples. Many are blonde and blue-eyed. They're geographically European, linguistically related to German. By the Nazis' own stated criteria, Slavs should have qualified as Aryan. Instead, they were classified as Untermenschen, subhumans. Why? Because Nazi Germany wanted to conquer Eastern Europe. General Plan Ost, the Master Plan East, called for the deportation or extermination of 31 million Slavs to make room for German colonists. You can't colonize and enslave people you've classified as racial equals, so the ideology changed to fit the political goal. The same regime that welcomed Iranian students and granted Turks European status was simultaneously implementing policies of mass starvation and extermination against European Slavs. But even the Aryan status didn't guarantee safety. In one incident, SA brownshirts attacked Iranian students on Berlin streets despite their official classification. The Iranian Foreign Ministry had to lodge a formal complaint. Even with Aryan status, Iranians weren't safe from Nazi violence on the ground. This wasn't inconsistency. This was the system working as designed. The hierarchy of power and political ambition always superseded any notional hierarchy of race. So, what does all this tell us about Nazi racial ideology? It wasn't science. It wasn't even consistent pseudoscience. It was a political weapon, deployed when useful, discarded when inconvenient. The Nazis claimed their racial theories were objective, based on biology, anthropology, skull measurements, genetic analysis. They published books. They established research institutes. They created elaborate charts and classification systems. But when examined, the classifications follow political necessity, not scientific logic. Iranians were Aryan because Germany wanted influence in the Middle East and economic partnership. Even though some Nazi theorists believed modern Iranians were racially impure, the regime ignored this for political gain. Turks were European because Germany wanted to keep Turkey neutral and needed access to strategic waterways. But only non-Jewish Turks, while Turkey abandoned its Jewish citizens. Japanese had ambiguous honorary Aryan status because Germany needed Japan as an ally, but official classification created diplomatic complications, so they used strategic ambiguity instead. But Slavs, who by any linguistic or genetic measure were as Aryan as Germans, were subhuman because Germany wanted their land for colonization. Jews, Roma, and others were targeted for extermination not because of any scientific criteria, but because Nazi ideology required an enemy to blame and eliminate. The racial classifications weren't scientific discoveries. They were political decisions dressed up in scientific language. This is the danger of pseudoscience. It provides the appearance of objectivity to justify whatever those in power want to do. And Nazi racial theory was designed specifically to be flexible enough to justify anything. Modern scholarship has conclusively shown that Nazi racial classifications were never based on science. They were political tools. Recent research from Cambridge University revealed that even the term honorary Aryan for Japanese was never official policy. It was a rumor that Nazi officials allowed to spread because ambiguity served their interests. The Nazis published elaborate charts, established research institutes, created classification systems with pseudo-scientific terminology. But when you examine the actual decisions, they follow political necessity, not biological logic. The term Aryan itself, originally referring to ancient Indo-Iranian peoples, was stolen and twisted beyond recognition. What started as a legitimate linguistic and historical designation became Nazi propaganda. The blonde, blue-eyed imagery, marketing, a simplified symbol for public consumption. The reality behind closed doors was far more cynical. Race was whatever served Nazi interests in that moment, and this flexibility didn't reduce the horror, it enabled it. Because if racial categories are arbitrary and political, then anyone can be reclassified as subhuman whenever convenient. Today, you're an ally. Tomorrow, you're an enemy. The ideology provides no protection because the ideology has no consistency. The malleability wasn't a bug. It was a feature. It allowed the regime to justify any action, no matter how contradictory or barbaric. Hitler personally declared Iran an Aryan country. An Iranian Nazi copied Hitler's mustache and mannerisms, broadcast anti-Jewish propaganda, and fought in Berlin. He later became a Swedish professor and is buried in Uppsala. The Nazis classified non-Jewish Turks as European, while Turkey stripped its Jewish citizens of nationality, abandoning them to the Holocaust. Honorary Aryan status for Japanese was just a diplomatic rumor, never official policy. But 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. Millions of Slavs were targeted for extermination. Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, all killed. The lesson isn't that Nazi racial ideology was flexible. The lesson is that it was never real. It was a weapon, applied when convenient, ignored when inconvenient, twisted to serve power. Understanding this matters because it shows how pseudoscience can justify anything if people want to believe it badly enough, and how ideology becomes most dangerous when it pretends to be objective truth.